What Pershing told Patton after he led the tank attack that won WW1, September 1918. The war had already devoured a generation, and somewhere beyond the smoke of the Meuse Hills, a hard-driving American officer was limping through mud with a pistol in one hand and a tank battle collapsing around him. He was not supposed to be there. Men of his rank were supposed to command from the rear, study maps, send runners, preserve order. But George S. Patton had never been made for distance. He wanted dust on his boots, shell bursts over his head, and the chance to force history open with his own hands. That morning he had driven his new weapon straight into one of the deadliest killing grounds in France, convinced that steel, speed, and nerve could do what 4 years of slaughter had failed to do. And then the machine guns found him. Before sunset, word raced up the chain of command. Patton was down, wounded. The tanks had punched forward, the line had shifted, and the American attack that helped break the old stalemate had cost one of its fiercest believers a piece of his own body. Somewhere behind the front, General John J. Pershing received the news. To most men, that moment would have been simple. Praise the bravery, mourn the wound, move on. But nothing involving Patton was ever simple. Pershing knew him too well. He knew the hunger behind the performance, the ambition behind the courage, and the danger in a man who never asked whether something should be done if he had already decided it could be done. What Pershing said next mattered, because it was more than comfort for a wounded officer. It was a verdict on the kind of soldier Patton had become, and on the kind of war America was now learning to fight. Long before France, before tanks, before the roar of engines and the shock of machine gun fire, Patton was a problem waiting for a battlefield. He had been born into stories of war and raised on heroic memory. In his mind, war was not merely a profession. It was a proving ground, almost a private religion. He grew up believing that greatness did not arrive quietly. It had to be seized in moments when other men hesitated. Even as a young officer, he carried himself with a burning intensity that made some men admire him and others distrust him. He loved discipline, but not the kind that reduced a man to obedience alone. Patton believed discipline existed to sharpen force, and force existed to decide events. He entered the army as a cavalryman, and that mattered. Cavalry officers of his generation still inherited an old martial dream. They imagined decisive movement, sudden violence, commanders riding forward to break uncertainty with nerve. Patton loved horses, swords, and every symbol of aggressive action. Yet the tragedy of his generation was that the old ways had run headfirst into modern firepower. Machine guns, barbed wire, trenches, artillery, poison gas, industrial killing on a scale no cavalry manual had prepared them to meet. Across Europe, romantic ideas of battle had been shredded in fields of mud. The men who could not adapt became ghosts of another century. The men who could adapt would define the future. Patton might have remained only a theatrical cavalryman if not for John J. Pershing. That relationship, forged before the great offensives in France, helps explain why the moment after Patton's tank attack carried such electricity. Pershing was not a sentimental commander. He admired energy, competence, physical hardness, and relentless work. He also had a sharp eye for ambitious younger officers. During the punitive expedition into Mexico in 1916, Patton had already shown Pershing what kind of officer he was: bold, eager, impatient for action, and always willing to push himself to the front. It was in Mexico that Patton first tasted the intoxicating mix of violence and publicity. He took part in a motorized raid that killed Julio Cardenas, one of Pancho Villa's lieutenants, and the exploit gained attention. It was modern, aggressive, and dramatic, the sort of action that fit Patton's instincts perfectly. Pershing saw the usefulness in that sort of man. He also saw the risk. Patton was brave, yes, but bravery by itself could become vanity in uniform. Still, Pershing kept him close. Patton admired Pershing with nearly devotional intensity. To him, Pershing represented what command ought to be: controlled, hard, exacting, and utterly dedicated to war as a serious business. Patton studied him the way an apprentice studies a master. He borrowed from Pershing's style, his discipline, even his sense of bearing. But there was a difference between them that would always matter. Pershing was granite, Patton was flame. When America entered the First World War in 1917, Patton followed Pershing to France. Many officers wanted glory. Patton wanted something more dangerous. He wanted a place where the new war was being invented. At first, the American Expeditionary Forces were an army in formation, rushing into a conflict that had already transformed every assumption about battle. The Europeans had paid in blood for their education. The Americans arrived with energy, confidence, and in many cases, a lack of experience. Pershing faced enormous pressures. British and French leaders wanted American troops fed into existing Allied formations as replacements, but Pershing insisted on building and fighting a distinct American army. That decision was strategic, political, and symbolic. It meant the Americans had to learn fast. Patton, meanwhile, was searching for his own opening. He found it in tanks. To many traditional officers, tanks looked awkward, unreliable, even ridiculous. They broke down. They bogged in mud. Their engines overheated. Their crews choked on fumes. Inside, they were metal ovens vibrating with noise and terror. Yet Patton looked at them and saw the future. Not because they were perfect, but because they could move through the world that machine guns had frozen. A cavalryman by instinct, he understood the value of mobility, shock, and sudden penetration. Tanks offered a new way to bring movement back to the battlefield. They were ugly, mechanical beasts, but to Patton, they carried the spirit of mounted warfare into the industrial age. He pushed hard to join the Tank Corps and became the first officer assigned to it in the American Army. That alone says something about his talent for placing himself near the edge of change. Once there, he threw himself into the work with ferocious seriousness. He studied French tank methods. He absorbed technical detail. He organized training with the same urgency he brought to combat. He helped establish the American Tank School in France, where inexperienced soldiers had to be turned into crews for a weapon few Americans understood. It was not glamorous work at first. It meant planning, teaching, drilling, correcting, pushing. Patton did it anyway because he understood that glory belongs to the men who are ready when the hour arrives. And when the hour arrived, it came wrapped in mud, smoke, engine failure, chaos, and the stubborn problem that had always defined Patton: he could not stay in the rear. By late summer 1918, the war was moving into its final and most decisive phase. The German offensives earlier that year had failed to break the Allies. Now the initiative was shifting. American manpower was swelling the front, and Pershing was preparing to prove that his independent army could strike with weight and success. The Saint-Mihiel offensive would be the first major operation conducted by the American First Army as its own force. It carried military value, but it also carried prestige. Pershing needed a clean, forceful success. Patton needed a battlefield worthy of his obsession. He had been placed in command of the 1st Provisional Tank Brigade, later redesignated the 304th Tank Brigade. On paper, the plan was simple enough. Tanks would support infantry attacks through the tortured ground of the salient. In reality, nothing in 1918 was simple. Coordination between infantry, artillery, tanks, aircraft, and command posts was fragile. Ground conditions could wreck timing. Smoke could disorient units. Shell craters could trap vehicles. Communications could disappear in minutes. Tanks that looked powerful on a staff map might die helplessly in the mud before reaching the first objective. Patton knew all of this. He also knew morale mattered. Before Saint-Mihiel, he gave his men the kind of speech only George Patton could give. He did not flatter them. He did not offer safety. He told them American tanks did not surrender, and that as long as one tank could move, it had to go forward. It was pure Patton, blunt, theatrical, and deadly sincere. He was not merely talking about machines. He was laying down a creed. Forward movement, even under disaster, was itself a moral act. When the offensive began on September 12, 1918, Patton did not remain where a safer man would have stayed. He moved toward the front to see his tanks in action for himself. There, amid shellfire and confusion, he crossed paths with Douglas MacArthur, another aggressive American officer, who also believed distance from danger was a kind of weakness. The meeting feels almost too symbolic to be real. Two future legends, standing under fire in the old war, both already testing the limits of command. Patton later wrote with cool humor about how neither man could fully focus on conversation because shells kept landing nearby. That was Patton's style. Under danger, he often became even more alive. At St. Mihiel, he did what he always did when he sensed hesitation. He inserted himself physically into the problem. He led infantry across a bridge they feared might be mined. He hitched rides on tanks. He pushed attacks toward Benny. He helped maintain momentum not from a desk, but from the edge of the fighting. It was reckless and effective at the same time. That combination would define him for the rest of his career. His men saw that he demanded what he was willing to risk himself. His superiors saw something more complicated. Aggressive officers were useful, but useful officers who got themselves killed or removed from communication at the decisive moment could become liabilities. Still, St. Mihiel was a success. The salient that had bulged into Allied lines for years was reduced, and the Americans had announced themselves as a force capable of major offensive action. Tanks had not won the battle alone. No honest telling of 1918 can reduce such operations to one branch, one unit, or one heroic officer. Artillery, infantry, air support, logistics, planning, and sheer Allied weight mattered enormously. But tanks had helped restore movement where the front had so often been fixed, and Patton had shown that he could not only worship action, he could shape it. That should have been enough for many men. It was not enough for Patton. The real test was still ahead. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, launched later in September, would become the largest operation in American military history to that date. It was vast, brutal, costly, and essential to the final collapse of German resistance. The terrain was worse, the enemy tougher, and the confusion deeper. Here, the war's ending would not feel neat or triumphant. It would feel like men clawing through one last wall of steel. Patton approached it with the same fierce confidence he had shown earlier, but by now the stakes had changed. St. Mihiel had proven the Americans could attack successfully. The Meuse-Argonne would help determine whether they could endure the full violence of a modern offensive against layered German defenses. Every yard mattered. Every delay cost blood. Every failure in timing magnified the killing. Patton devised a concentrated tank thrust, and again focused on the problem that obsessed him: how to use armored force to break paralysis. The battlefield, however, was merciless. Trenches, shell holes, broken roads, damaged ground, and enemy fire turned movement into a constant negotiation with disaster. Tanks could terrify defenders, but only if they reached them. If they stalled or became isolated, they turned into hulking targets. The morning of September 26 was gray with dread. Men moved into the offensive, carrying all the burden of those who had gone before them. Artillery thundered. Infantry advanced. Tanks lurched forward into smoke. Somewhere in that confusion, Patton once again left the relative safety of his command arrangement and followed the action on foot. This was not carelessness in the ordinary sense. It was a command philosophy rooted in conviction. Patton believed battle could not be understood from too far away. He believed leaders had to see, to judge, to force decisions in person when necessary. He also believed, perhaps too much, that his own presence could change the chemistry of fear around him. At one point, the tanks were blocked by trenches that needed to be opened for passage. Patton, instead of issuing orders from a distance and waiting, joined the labor of forcing a path through. He was seen with shovel in hand, driving men forward, even striking at least one reluctant soldier with the flat urgency of a commander who could not accept delay. That moment tells you almost everything about him. He was not a patient man. Delay felt to him like surrender in disguise. Where another officer might see caution, Patton often saw weakness. Where another might see impossibility, he saw a personal insult. Then came the machine gun fire. German positions in the Meuse-Argonne were not collapsing out of courtesy to history. They were still lethal, disciplined, and deeply entrenched. Patton found himself among infantrymen pinned down under vicious fire. Tanks alone could not solve the problem at that instant. The attack was stalling under direct resistance. Men were hugging the earth. To remain there meant paralysis. To rise meant possible death. This was the type of moment Patton had always imagined in advance, the kind of crisis where a man either confirms the legend he has built in his own mind or dies under the weight of it. He chose to rise. He rallied volunteers and called for men to move with him. Accounts describe him urging them forward with the raw force of his personality. He went toward the fire, not away from it. He was leading from the front in the oldest sense, except now the front was a landscape ruled by machine gun bursts rather than saber charges. It was bravery. It was madness. It was exactly what Patton believed an officer should do. And then a bullet smashed into him. He was hit in the leg, a serious wound that tore into him and dropped him hard. For a lesser personality, that might have ended the day in silence and shock. Patton did not surrender himself so easily. Even wounded, he continued trying to direct the fight. He was furious not only at the pain, but at the interruption. He had imagined glory many times in life, but he did not imagine it as passive suffering. He wanted motion, command, impact. To be carried off the field while battle continued without him was almost an insult greater than the wound itself. Yet that wound, and the attack surrounding it, became one of the defining passages of his life. Later memory often inflated or simplified these moments, because history loves symbols. In some tellings, Patton appears nearly mythic, a prophet of armored war striding through shellfire to force the future into existence. In others, he looks like a dangerously impulsive officer whose appetite for exposure bordered on irresponsibility. The truth lies in the collision between those views. He was both the apostle of modern aggression and a man almost addicted to proving himself under fire. That is why Pershing's reaction mattered so much. Pershing understood the need for offensive spirit. He also understood the cost when a commander's appetite outran prudence. By the time Patton was evacuated, blood soaking through bandages, he had already made his mark. The tank arm in the American force had been blooded under fire. Patton himself had shown unmistakably that armor, properly used and aggressively led, belonged in the future of war. The attack did not single-handedly win the First World War. No one officer and no one action can bear that claim honestly. But within the mythology of Patton's rise, and within the emotional truth of what the Allies were doing in those final weeks, his tank-led assault stood as one of those moments when the old static nightmare of trench warfare began giving way to a new form of battle. Men like Patton felt it in their bones. Steel had moved, lines had bent, the logic of warfare was changing, and still, in the rear, one question remained: what would Pershing say? To understand the tension in that question, you have to remember Patton's place in Pershing's world. Patton was not just any subordinate, he was a known quantity. Pershing had watched him for years. He knew Patton's hunger for notice, but he also knew that beneath the grand manner there was real labor, real seriousness, and real professional growth. Patton had not stumbled into tanks as a stunt. He had studied them, organized them, fought with them, and bled with them. Yet Pershing also knew Patton had again exposed himself in ways that commanders do not always forgive. Military systems rely on control, and control depends on commanders staying alive and connected. A dead hero can be less useful than a living planner. Pershing, more than most men, knew that war cannot be won by glamour alone. Some officers around Pershing likely expected a mixed judgment. Patton's bravery was undeniable. His forward movement had inspired men and helped keep pressure on the enemy. But he had once again gone beyond safe command habits. If Pershing wanted to make a point about discipline, this was the moment. If he wanted to encourage exactly that kind of hard-driving aggression in the final push of the war, this was also the moment. The message would signal more than his opinion of Patton. It would reveal what kind of army Pershing believed America needed. Patton, meanwhile, lay in pain with a mind that never knew how to rest. A wound in battle can create a strange isolation. Around you there may be orderlies, doctors, murmured voices, the smell of antiseptic, the dull ache of morphine. But inside the mind, the battle keeps going. Patton did not experience combat as a single episode that ended when he left the field. He replayed it, judged it, argued with it. He thought about what should have happened faster, what should have broken sooner, what he should have done next. He was also painfully aware that reputations are fixed in moments like these. He had built himself for war. Now war had answered. Would he be remembered as the officer who proved the tank arm in battle, or as the reckless commander who got himself shot because he could not stay put? He wrote home in his own hard, almost cheerful style, making light of the wound in terms that revealed both toughness and vanity. But beneath that bravado was a more serious need. He wanted recognition from the man whose approval mattered more than any headline or decoration. Pershing's judgment was not merely professional to Patton. It was almost filial. If Pershing condemned him, the wound would feel deeper than the bullet. If Pershing approved, it would validate years of striving. The war did not pause for Patton's recovery. The Meuse-Argonne ground on. American units kept attacking. Casualties mounted. German resistance, though weakening in the larger strategic sense, remained savage at the tactical level. Still, the overall direction of the war was changing. The Allies were pressing hard all across the front. Germany was cracking under strain. What had once seemed impossible in the trench deadlock was beginning to occur. The war was moving toward an end, though not a gentle one. In that violent transition, Patton became something more than a wounded officer. He became a symbol of the kind of commander that the next age might reward. He had come from cavalry, embraced machinery, and treated armored war not as an auxiliary novelty, but as a decisive instrument. Pershing could see that. Even if tanks in 1918 were crude, even if they were still subordinate to infantry methods, the principle mattered. Mobility, shock, aggressive exploitation, relentless advance, these were not passing curiosities. They were hints of the battlefield to come. That is why the words Pershing sent or spoke to Patton after the attack have been remembered less as a polished ceremonial line than as a soldier's judgment. Pershing was not the kind of man to gush. He was not likely to drape praise in softness. The essence of what he conveyed to Patton was hard, spare, and immensely revealing. You did well. You proved your tanks. Now get well and be ready. Because this is the kind of fighting that wins wars. However those words were phrased in the moment, that was the meaning that mattered. It was not indulgence. It was not a rebuke wrapped in courtesy. It was recognition. For Patton, recognition from Pershing landed like a second commission. It told him that his instinct had not betrayed him. It told him that the offensive spirit he worshipped still had a place, even in a world of engines and industrial firepower. It told him that the tank was not a sideshow. It told him, above all, that personal courage was not enough unless it was married to battlefield effect. And in Pershing's eyes, Patton had produced effect. He had not merely rushed toward bullets for display. He had led a force that helped push the American army through one of the last and greatest struggles of the war. But Pershing's approval, real as it was, contained an iron edge. Men like Pershing never praised recklessness without silently measuring its cost. What Patton likely heard underneath the commendation was this: bravery is useful only if it serves victory. Get yourself killed and you cheat the army of what you can still do. That lesson never fully cured Patton, but it stayed with him. Across the decades that followed, he would still drive forward with the same violent momentum. He would still believe that audacity could stun slower minds into defeat. Yet he would also become one of the clearest apostles of operational movement, not just personal heroics. The point was never simply to be brave. The point was to break the enemy before the enemy could recover. In the hospital and in the weeks after, Patton had time, perhaps more than he wanted, to think about what had happened. Pain can strip vanity down to essentials. For a man like Patton, who had always imagined himself riding the storm of history, being forced still by a wound was almost unbearable. Yet stillness can sharpen ambition. He now knew two things with certainty. First, he had met battle face to face and had not flinched. Second, the future belonged to armored force in ways most traditional officers still failed to grasp. That belief became the bridge between the First World War and the legend of the Second. Without France in 1918, there is no fully formed Patton of North Africa, Sicily, France, or the dash across Europe. The later image, gleaming helmet, pearl-handled pistols, hard speeches, thunderous confidence, did not emerge from nowhere. It was forged in the mud of Saint-Mihiel and the blood of the Meuse-Argonne. Those fields taught him the cost of hesitation, the limits of static warfare, and the psychological power of relentless movement. They also taught him something about Pershing. Patton had adored great commanders from a distance as a young man. Under Pershing, he saw how real command functioned. It was not theatrical courage alone. It was organization, endurance, discipline, and the ability to subordinate vanity to larger purpose. Pershing's reaction to his wounding and his combat leadership confirmed that the old cavalry ideal had not died. It had been transformed. The commander of the future still needed nerve, but nerve had to be joined to machines, systems, supply, and timing. Patton never forgot the nerve. Sometimes he forgot the rest. But the best version of Patton, the one that could achieve operational breakthroughs at terrifying speed, came from that merger. There is another reason the moment after the attack carries such weight. In war, men often spend years chasing a sentence. Not any sentence. A sentence from the one man whose judgment stands above the noise. Decorations shine. Newspaper praise fades. Public fame distorts. But one quiet judgment from the commander you respect can mark a life. Patton, for all his vanity, was not immune to that deeper human need. He wanted Pershing to see him clearly, not as a showman, not as a nuisance, not as an overeager subordinate, but as the fighting commander he believed himself to be. After the tank assault and the wound, Pershing did see him clearly. He saw both the fire and the usefulness of the fire. That mattered even after the armistice. When the guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918, the war ended before Patton could return to the front in the way he wanted. To him, peace was almost frustrating. That sounds perverse to ordinary men, but Patton was never ordinary in his relationship to combat. He felt most alive in purposeful violence. Yet even in post-war disappointment, he carried forward the essential lesson of his final campaign. Mechanized breakthrough, driven by will, could rip open a battlefield that older minds thought fixed. The American Army after the Great War did not immediately become the mechanized striking force Patton imagined. Budgets shrank. Institutions settled back into habits. Traditional branches guarded their identities. Tanks were still often treated as infantry helpers, rather than the spearheads of independent armored maneuver. Patton spent the interwar years fighting not only bureaucratic battles, but also intellectual ones. He wrote, argued, studied, and pushed the cause of armored warfare even as the army around him moved slowly. It is tempting to view this as the labor of a visionary ignored by his time. The reality is more complicated. Patton was right about movement, shock, and exploitation, but he was also a difficult personality in a bureaucracy that did not always reward volcanic intensity. Still, he persisted. And under that persistence was the memory of 1918. He remembered the trenches that stalled the tanks. He remembered the infantry pinned by machine guns. He remembered the confusion when units lost momentum. He remembered the sheer strategic value of speed when speed could be achieved. Most of all, he remembered the feeling of being at the hinge of an era. He had seen the end of one kind of war and the birth pains of another. Once a man has felt that, ordinary peace can seem thin. Pershing, for his own part, remained the towering American figure of the First World War. His prestige was immense, but so was the burden of his command record. He had built, defended, and deployed an independent American army under enormous pressure. He knew what aggressive officers were worth, because he had needed them. He also knew how war chewed them up. In men like Patton, he saw the future, but also the perpetual hazard of a warrior who sometimes loved attack more than coordination. His post-war judgments about officers were shaped by both admiration and caution. That is why the emotional truth of what he told Patton after the attack survives even if the exact phrasing has been blurred by time and retelling. Pershing's message was not the message of a romantic dreamer praising empty gallantry. It was the appraisal of a hard commander recognizing a younger officer who had proved two things under fire: that he had courage beyond dispute, and that armored force, properly driven, could matter decisively in the modern battlefield. To Patton, that was not a compliment. It was permission from history. The war-winning language around Patton's WW-1 tank attack grew larger with the years, especially after he became famous in the next World War. Later generations looked backward and searched for the first glimpse of the man who would one day race across France. They found him in 1918, limping through shell holes, shouting men forward, refusing to let tanks or infantry stop merely because the ground ahead was murderous. In that image, People recognized the seed of everything that came later. So the story sharpened itself the way legends do. This was the attack that mattered. This was the wound that proved him. This was the moment Pershing spoke the words that foretold the future. Legends simplify, but they often preserve a deeper reality. The deeper reality here is that Patton's identity as a commander was forged when he learned that speed under fire could decide the emotional balance of battle. Men under machine gun pressure can feel trapped in a universe where death belongs to the side that moves. A leader who restores movement changes not just position on a map, but the psychology of the fight. Patton understood this instinctively. Tanks terrified defenders not only because they crushed obstacles, but because they made the enemy feel that the old safety of trenches was slipping away. Movement broke certainty. Once certainty broke, collapse could begin. That insight lived in him for the next quarter century. In North Africa, Sicily, and especially the breakout in France in 1944, Patton would again seek to shatter the enemy's mental stability by relentless advance. He wanted no pause that gave the opponent time to breathe, dig, reform, or believe. His campaigns later would have aircraft, radios, fast columns, modern logistics, and a scale of armored warfare far beyond 1918. Yet the emotional core remained the same as it had been near Chepi and in the mud of the Argonne. Keep moving, keep striking. Do not let the enemy recover his confidence. The wounded officer on the French battlefield became the general who would terrify enemies and exasperate allies. And sitting underneath that transformation was the invisible weight of Pershing's judgment. When the older commander effectively told him that he had done his work well and had helped show how wars could be won, Patton received more than validation. He received a mission that outlived the First World War. This helps explain why Patton spent so much of his later life performing Patton. Many people see only the helmet, the profanity, the fierce speeches, the dramatic self-presentation. They miss the interior engine of that performance. Patton was always trying to be equal to the destiny he believed war had shown him. He had been told, in effect, by the commander he revered, that he was one of the men built for the new battlefield. Once a man accepts that identity, he has no easy peace left. Every future war becomes a chance to prove the verdict correct. Even so, the Pershing moment was not merely triumphant. It carried a quiet warning, because if Pershing respected Patton's drive, he also knew what that drive could do to the man who carried it. Patton was the kind of officer who could burn through himself. He did not moderate naturally, he intensified. That trait inspired men when linked to clear purpose. It could also create scandal, conflict, and needless risk. Pershing's generation valued offensive spirit, but it also understood command responsibility in a brutally unsentimental way. A commander belongs partly to his men and to the mission, not solely to his own appetite for danger. Did Patton fully learn that restraint? Only partly. Throughout his life he remained drawn to the front, to personal exposure, to the electric charge of action close enough to smell. He matured into a far larger commander, one responsible for entire armies, rather than a brigade of tanks, but the fire never left him. In some ways, that was why he was extraordinary. In other ways, it was why he was always hazardous to contain. Yet on that day in 1918, after the tank-led assault and the wound, those contradictions had not yet become the legend's burden. They existed in sharper, younger form. Patton was still becoming himself. Pershing was still deciding what sort of instrument this man might one day be. And for one brief moment, the whole future of American mechanized war seemed to flicker in the exchange between them. Imagine Patton hearing the message while confined to a bed he hated, his body damaged, his mind racing back toward the front. Imagine what mattered to him in that instant. Not sympathy. Patton did not crave softness, not pity. He would have despised pity. What he needed was the acknowledgement that his wound had purchased something more than a personal story. He needed to know the attack had counted, that the tanks had mattered, that his instinct for violent motion had not been a private madness. Pershing gave him that. He told him, in the hard language of soldiers, that he had done exactly what needed to be done. That is the heart of the story. Not that Pershing offered some ornate prophecy, not that Patton was handed an easy blessing, but that one of the most disciplined commanders America ever produced looked at the bloody, reckless, brilliant performance of a younger officer and judged that it had value beyond the wound. The battlefield had tested Patton's ideas, his courage, and his fitness for the kind of war that was emerging from the ruins of the old one. Pershing's answer was yes. Yes, the tanks had shown their worth. Yes, Patton had led from the front with real effect. Yes, the war would be won by men who could combine iron discipline with forward violence. Now survive, recover, and be ready for what comes next. That last idea may be the most haunting, because what came next was not another chance in 1918. It was an entire future. Patton survived the Great War, carried its lessons through years of neglect and argument, and then exploded back onto history's stage when the world descended into mechanized conflict again. When German panzer warfare stunned Europe, Patton was one of the few senior Americans who understood in his bones what armored movement could mean. He had felt the first crude version of it while Europe still bled under barbed wire. He had already believed in the weapon before most others treated it seriously. And somewhere behind that confidence was the memory that Pershing had not laughed at his conviction. Pershing had confirmed it. So when people ask what Pershing told Patton after he led the tank attack that won the war, the deepest answer is not a single polished sentence preserved in amber. It is a judgment. Pershing told Patton that he had done his duty with ferocity, that he had helped prove a new kind of fighting, and that his work was not finished simply because he was wounded. To a man like Patton, those words would have rung louder than any medal citation, because Patton did not want to be admired from a distance. He wanted to be used. He wanted battle to choose him again. And in that aftermath, bloodied but unbroken, with Pershing's approval hardening inside him like steel, George S. Patton began the long transformation from ambitious young officer into the ruthless prophet of armored war. The bullet in his leg healed. The war ended. The mud dried, but the message endured. You were right to drive forward. You were right to trust the machine. You were right to believe movement can break deadlock. Now live long enough to do it on a scale the world has not yet seen. That was what Pershing gave him after the attack. Not comfort, not sentiment, permission.